Welcome, 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 one and all, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another episode of WIC TV. It's a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. And tonight, we are going to be discussing religion. Is religion necessary or helpful or even a positive in modern society? We're going to talk about that. We got some great guests tonight to discuss. And gang, I hope that you have a wonderful time. If you have questions or comments for either of these individuals as we go, super chat them and I'll try to get them in, right? Or throw some bits if you're on Twitch or whatever, and we'll try to get the comments I can in. I appreciate all for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to get the mic first to Mrs. Marlo, and she's going to be making her argument, and then we're going to give it to you, Chris, and we'll have a open discussion. So, Marlo, take it away. Go ahead. Open it up.
Howdy, everybody. So I'm here to take the stance that religion is a net negative in modern society, and I think that in order for I will say this is a pretty strong stance. It's a bit indefensible at times, and I'm aware of that. So I think a couple of those terms need to be rock solid. When I say religion, what I'm talking about are doctrinal spiritual precepts that have to deal with the supernatural, that are used to dictate behavior and customs in the natural ordered world, right? And so when I take the stance that that idea of religion is a net negative for modern society, the thing that I'm talking about is progress. When modernity has made progress in things like decreasing global poverty, or original answers to moral questions that had not yet come up in our times, or even questions that had been long argued, those good things that we've done for minorities, for the poor, for the sick, have in our era been in spite of religious precepts. And I have this notion that to properly answer the question, what is the right thing to do, you have to have a degree of skepticism. You have to have a willingness to apply reason, and you have to have an open mind to the possibility of what answer will be the best answer. And I think that rigid, structured, supernatural precepts are inhibiting to that project. So that's my stance there.
Okay, thanks for being here. We're going to get into it as we go. And Eucharist is here to argue the opposite. Go ahead, Eucharist. Tell people who you are and give us your argument. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name's Philip. I go by Eucharist on the internet, but also Philip. I write sometimes on Substack at everythingwasbeautiful.substack.com if you want to go read that. At first, I just want to open by asking how my opponent could possibly justify claims about things being necessary or helpful without presupposing a God. And no, I'm just kidding. I got on my precept phase in high school. In 1963, Kurt Vonnegut publishes this novel, Cat's Cradle. It's one of my favorite novels. And I think one of the core ideas of this novel is an interesting question, which is, could you have a religion that was made up, whole cloth, admitted openly to its followers that it's made up, that it is, as the Book of Bokonon says, nothing but a pack of lies, while still maintaining the salutary effects of religion, right? So religion, on Vonnegut's account, offers community and meaning and purpose and a motivation for good conduct. And I think that, as far as I'm aware of it, empirical research sort of supports the idea that believers today still are, happier, healthier, and so on. Could we possibly replicate that or those benefits with non-religious alternatives, or even a fictional religious alternative? I would suggest no. I think it's an interesting question precisely because it's baffling or befuddling to people like Vonnegut, socialist, humanist, atheist that he was, why we couldn't find a substitute for this or haven't found a substitute for it. I don't think we have found a clean substitute for religion. And so, yeah, my case is that religion itself remains useful and important. So cards on the table, if you haven't seen me on Wick's channel before, I am a Christian. So that means that there are things about my faith that I just think are true, right? I believe in the resurrection, for example, right? So, but today I think I'm going to be making a lot of practical arguments, and in so doing, I'm not trying to say that the truth of the matter is not relevant. I think it is. But we also have a host of really smart people through history. So people like John Adams or Tocqueville or Vonnegut and others who, while not being devout themselves, recognize the benefits that religion offers society, and even in some cases suggest religion is necessary in some way. And so I expect today we'll see some arguments that whatever, as she's already said, whatever help religion may have been in the past, we've now sort of moved past the need from it, because of progressive application of reasoning, especially secular reasoning. Whatever made religion useful, helpful, necessary in the past, we don't need it anymore, and that it's maybe at best neutral, maybe in most cases a negative. I am going to suggest, I think the opposite, that I don't know how you could continue always to support the things that religion has made sort of default settings for us with the complete abolition of religion, and especially taking that sort of like more skeptical stance, the Tocqueville or Adams stance, for example. I think I'm not sure how you would motivate people to adopt the practical things that we enjoy about religion without some of them being sincerely religious. So I'm excited to see where this goes, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, thanks for
I
being
definitely
here.
think
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
first.
wife, my bad. I definitely think that it's important for me to say that so I am an atheist, but I find that term really annoying because it's simply a lack thereof, right? And I don't think that atheism in and of itself is a solution to any problems. It is a removal of a problem, as far as I'm concerned. And atheism in and of itself is not sufficient to move the progress, like the moral reasoning and the philosophical and artistic and cultural things that I think are important to move those things forward. Atheism is not something; it is a lack of something. And I think that when we talk about if like a hypothetical world where religious precepts or religiosity in and of itself is not part of a society anymore. We're talking about a world where something else has to definitely be installed, right? Like humanism or Aristotelian naturalism to make it sound super fucking exciting. But like, I don't want to come off sounding like the only thing we need to do is get these damn Christians to shut the fuck up. Like, I actually don't think that that's even the point. The point is that like better conversations can and should be had, right? Here's let's pick a pet issue, right? Like one of the easiest attack vectors on this argument is like the issue of contraception. Which has been described as a problem, like from the position of the Catholic Church and a couple of different Orthodox churches, and now we even have like evangelicals in America complaining about foreign aid of condoms to third world countries that are war ravaged. And like when we talk about like why is contraception a moral good or a moral evil, that's a comparison between a harm reduction practice and a spiritual totalitarianism. And I think that like that's a really it's a really on my side example to be giving, right? It definitely like kind of leans my way. But the manner in which we discuss this like spiritual totalitarianism versus a more progressive question of like, well, is it better for AIDS not to spread? Is it better for children not to be born in excess during a civil war? The possibility of asking those questions is the point for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess it's fair to me to ask those questions. I guess I think it's also fair to say that like for most people that does seem like the default setting. It's strange for us to realize how recently it was that contraception was not sort of legally protected in the United States. And so to me, like just thinking purely about like call it just constitutional law, right, about privacy, the developments we've had in just the past 50 to 60 years, it's I just the context that gives me is not necessarily like, wow, isn't it great that we're like super enlightened today? It's like, is it all that crazy to have a suggestion that maybe the default setting or what we experience as the default setting is not the default setting, or that other arguments couldn't be made? But I mean, fair point. I don't think a lot of people, especially in the audience, are going to be on my side if I start saying, well, no, we should go back to a world where pharmacies are getting punished by local cops for distributing condoms. I think there was something you said earlier that I was trying to latch onto and I've lost it now. But I think I guess I would want to push back on something you said in your opening about like these things, these, decreasing poverty, better answers to moral questions, etc., that these things are in spite of religion and not because of them. I guess I just have a really hard time with that, especially when we see just sort of objectively speaking, the kind of people who are, let's say, like donating most to charity, the kind of organizations that are spending the most on charitable aid, the kind of, especially the Catholic Church, institutionally, globally, largest single charitable organization in the world, like the things that they've done for healthcare, for those sorts of like, call it just physical ministries, I think is pretty astounding. And even today, like while we do have a pretty rigorous healthcare system that is, call it secular, we still have a huge amount of religious involvement in the healthcare system that is sometimes taken on. And, while nonprofits are not always not making money, some of them are taking losses to provide this care for local communities. So I guess that in spite of thing, I think is probably going to be the hook for us, where it's like, I'm not convinced of that in the same way that like, Christopher Hitchens was, who's like my big villain of the horsemen of new atheism. I think he's just kind of like overwrought in his criticisms of the harms of religion compared to the benefits, which he just sort of denounces. Yeah.
I do think that Hitch takes probably the most extreme view that I've ever heard. And sue me for liking a guy who's really, really tactful and sharp about it. But
Oh, he's great. He's so fun to listen to. I mean,
he's so
God,
powerful.
like God's Not Great is the most fun new atheist book to read. The God Delusion is pure suffering. So God's Not Great is the book to read if you want to get it. I'll agree with that.
I
So,
Go ahead, Wick.
yeah, I just have a question, I suppose, for you, Marlo, first, and I have one for Eucharist, if I may. On the idea of charity and aid to third world countries, etc., U.S. aid, right? Would we agree that that's a good thing, that our country should be pushing that? So,
Strongly.
a lot of
Yeah.
U.S. aid, if not most of U.S. aid, was religious organizations going through the government. They fought in the Supreme Court during the 90s, and they won. David French was instrumental in pushing the government being able to kind of give funds to these charitable organizations, these Christian organizations, these religious organizations that would go and do work in these third world countries, in Africa and these other places, right? And they had to fight for that. I mean, if we wanted a better world, right? If we want to reduce poverty and alleviate human suffering, why is it that we do not need religion anymore when it seems to be religion is the main thrust doing these things, at least to me?
I definitely don't want to sound like I'm disparaging charity because that's absolutely not the case. I definitely think that the merits of religion as it stands, to the degree that it's not conducting spiritual totalitarianism, is a totally good, community oriented, often grounding and what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Consoling factor of a lot of people's lives. Um, when we talk about USAID, we are talking about religiously motivated spending, but we are talking about government spending. So that has a little bit of a kind of a it's a little soured, right? I don't think it's the case necessarily that without religious organizations that the United States would have chosen to never do anything charitable, but obviously that's just a totally unfalsifiable claim. I want to say that the world that I want to see is obviously not currently here, right? And the world that I'm imagining when I look forward into a good future is a place where religious charity is an adopted good by all people, right? I don't think that you need religion to be a charitable person. And I think that I almost have this sense that associating charity with supernatural precepts kind of misses the point of the here and now lives of people who do need to be changed, which do need to be changed, excuse me, in order for their suffering to be decreased and their well-being to flourish.
Any
Can I,
responses to
before
that?
you ask? Yeah. Couple of things. I don't think the claim would be that like it's a good point that you're making, that this is government spending, but I think the point Wick is making is like the partner organizations that the government uses to actually effectuate these things seem largely to be religiously motivated. And so there's something about this like religious background that is kicking these people in the pants and making them actually establish the infrastructure to provide that care. I think that's a fair point about like, I would like everybody to be doing it. I don't think you have to be religious to be charitable, but I think there's a difference, let's say, between this is just on the brain. I'm not just doing this to be a nerd, but like I just finished teaching Aristotle's Ethics, right? And he has this virtue of magnificence, which is a kind of generosity that is the kind of generosity that only people with like superfluous amounts of wealth can give. And so one of the examples he gives is like, you have somebody rich in Athens who outfits their new fleet and slaps his name on the head boat, right? It's like, okay, I get a chance to get my name. Think the Sacklers, for example. These people who gave outlandish amounts of money to fund art museums and hospitals, who at the same time are doing lots of terrible things. I think that kind of virtue of philanthropy or magnificence is different than Christian charity, the kind of charity that like St. Basil the Great describes in his sermons that are collected now on social justice, where he tells all the people in his congregation, hey, if you have 2 shirts and somebody next to you has none, you are a thief. It's not just that like you should do a charitable thing, but you're stealing from him and you need to give of everything that you have. That kind of charity, I think, is far and above the kind of charity I would expect even a sort of beneficent humanist to be offering. So I really do like, I love Vonnegut, and he says multiple times throughout his writings, he's like, I just wouldn't want to be a human being if Jesus hadn't preached the Sermon on the Mount. And I agree with him, and I agree with Nietzsche that these things are transformative in the history of Western morals. And so I just don't know how we get where we are or how we go from here without that sort of as a bedrock. That's my intuition.
Do you have a question you wanted to ask Eucharist?
I do,
Wick?
but I wanted to make sure you guys get back and forth on this if you had something to respond. And once you're done with that, I can ask Eucharist his question. But I want
No,
to
I
make
think
sure.
I think he wrapped that up really beautifully. I'm happy to bite the bullet that charity is something that the religious do better.
Certainly.
I'm happy to bite that bullet.
Yes.
When it comes though to Eucharist, right? Your question.
Yeah.
Given the fact that we aren't just talking about are there any positives to religion, but is religion a net positive or a net negative? Surely we concede, even if we concede the charity argument, we can look at the world and some of the most religious societies in the world are places we would not want to live. Iran, right? Afghanistan. A lot of these places are constantly oppressing their people in the name of religion. They are constantly at war in the name of the religion. And even in European culture, right, up until very recently, Catholics and Protestants were burning each other alive, just constantly killing each other, right? And as we've moved away from that, that has happened less often. So, I mean, when we talk about human flourishing, as the world and the Western culture has gone away from religion, we have flourished. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, obviously, again, I'm a Christian, and so I think my religion is true and Islam is false,
Sure.
and so I don't want to be on the hook for defending Islamic regimes. Although I do think there are, just like sociologically speaking, there are practical benefits we could outline of any sincerely held religious belief, in terms of like community and belonging and all of that. But so I would say, yeah, 100%. Like there obviously are quote unquote religious regimes that do terrible things, and the simplistic answer is they're just the wrong religion. But as you mentioned, like obviously there are Christian regimes we can point to that have done terrible things. I think the thing I would push back on is that last claim of that as we've moved away from religion, things have gotten better. I would suggest that some of the things you're thinking of as moving away from religion might actually be sort of inherited from religion. So one thing that we get from the period of Christendom, the period where we don't have precisely a unification of church and state, but we have instead the church disciplining the state, is we get doctrines that actually limit the civil magistrate and its authority and its power that end up developing in Western political thought into the kind of liberty we enjoy today. So out of Christendom and the church's attempt to discipline the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, or the church and the nobles attempt to discipline the magistrate in England, we get the sort of Western legal tradition that says, no, the executive can't just do whatever they want. There are limits on this power, whether that's duty to God, whether that's responsibility to the people, whatever. I think these things, historically speaking, are at least partially outgrowths of Christian political theorizing. So I would say you describe it as a move away from religion. I might agree in the sense that it's a move away from a unification of the swords of church or of state and sacrament, but I don't know that it's a move away from religion so much as it is learning how to better administrate government with religious ideas or through the means of religious ideas, disciplining those things. Yeah.
Response to that, Marlo?
Yeah, I think I would argue that a little bit differently. My understanding of, especially the legal tradition specifically, of like Western Europe, was due to a mixing, first of like outside influence, like we got the scientific revolution from the Islamic countries, by virtue of the Crusades, etc. And then after that, we had this like Renaissance, right, where we got like via Andalusia, we got a lot of the like previously rejected Greek and Roman texts that we had, like when I say we, I mean the West, that we had largely said like, oh, there's no possible way that we could have had, sensible moral questions or philosophy before the, Nativity of Christ, and so we had rejected all those things. And when we got them back through multiculturalism, it inspired a really, really robust age of enlightenment, which was the foundational cultural movement that started to ask questions like, is the citizen sovereign? Is the individual sovereign? It gave us the philosophical frameworks and ethical frameworks that we use to develop the concept of rights. And so I think that it's absolutely the case that at the very bottom tier of this like structure that we've built, there is religion, right? And especially Christendom in the West. It proliferated literacy. It created it was our first attempt at mental health care, at hospitals, at like institution. It invented the bureaucrat. Like it's a powerful, powerful force for rule and civility and law and all of these really important things. But it's at the bottom tier. So when we talk about what came next, we're talking about then science and then philosophy, which grew up. It's so like I'll use the Hitch line. He loves to talk about how it's very sensible to use a blind man as a guide if you are walking through the dark, right? But once you get into the sunlight, it would probably be better just to use your own eyes, or hire a guide that can see. And so like there's this outgrowing of that. And I'm going to keep using the word supernatural totalitarianism or spiritual totalitarianism, because that's specifically what I'm talking about. I'm really not talking about the Unitarian Universalists who like to get together and affirm each other's existence and light and vaguely
What are they even
reference
doing those
God in
services?
some way. I don't
Just
know.
reading poetry
I'm considering attending one just to see how it is. 'Cause, my dad's an Anglican priest, and he has like he has talked my whole life about the Unitarian Universalists like they were going to make America worse. And I think like wasn't George MacDonald like C.S. Lewis's professor like a Unitarian Universalist? That guy seems cool. I don't know.
Oh, he was.
But yeah,
he was a heretic of some sort. I don't know what sort he was, but yeah,
just to be clear, right? I don't want us to fall into the trap of like, well, which religions are good and which religions are bad. Though I think that bears discussion to some level. But I don't want us to be like, well, here's this one single religion that might be positive, therefore religion as a whole is positive. Or here's this one single religion that's pretty negative, so therefore religion as a whole is a negative. I want to just talk about religion in general. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I on the
I didn't mean to, like I interrupted Marlo, so I want to make sure she finishes. Then then you can absolutely go.
I was pretty much wrapped up. You're good. Go ahead.
So yeah, on the like Renaissance things, I think two things. You're right, obviously, that this happens. Like there is a Renaissance and it happens for a reason. But I do think we tend to oversell the influence of these earlier thinkers on even like scholastic medieval thought. So if you go back to like Augustine, for example, in City of God, there's this whole section where he talks about the debt that he owes to the pagan thinkers, which is a very intentional counterpoint to like Tertullian, for example, who is like, oh, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, and goes through like the pagans as the source of all the heresies. Augustine is like, no, from Plato we learned this, from the Stoics we learned this, and like goes through and is like, here's what the inheritance we owe to these thinkers who by God's common grace were thinking really well about things. And then, obviously Aquinas, baptizing Aristotle. But I would say too, like I think what you're describing is like a heritage of the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. I agree partially, but then disagree partially because I think some of these things are things that are developing in medieval Christendom. So taking the king or the emperor and saying, hey, there are things that you can't do that are outside of your proper authority. That is like the church coming in and trying to discipline the state and restraining it in ways that were like unheard of in, call it like Germanic kingship or earlier kinds of kingship. So I think we owe religion a debt in those cases where it's coming in and saying, hey, there is a higher law, a higher power. And whether you want to say it's like, Ciceronian, natural law kind of religion or Christianity later on picking up Cicero, all of this is in a way coming in and saying, no, you can't do those things. And it leads directly into the things that we prize today. So what you're describing is like a religious or spiritual totalitarianism. I think I get what you're saying. Like I was just teaching Mills on liberty today. I think this is what he's thinking about, right? Any system that comes along and restrains your brain and says these things are out of bounds for you is in some way preventing you from experiencing internal liberty, and then usually expresses itself in some sort of external restraint on your liberty in terms of politics. I guess I'm just not as confident that's true. Especially in terms of, okay, let me try to run really quickly with one thing and then I'll shut up and I think that people operate when they're reasoning within traditions and most productively within bounds. So poetry is a great example of this. If you just try to teach a kid to write poetry and you give them nothing but blank verse or free verse, I think it's not good for developing a poet, right? You learn poetry by forms, by structures, by, well, here's a sonnet and here's a this and here's a that. And then they learn eventually to break those rules. I think religion and other forms of call them dogmas operate in a similar way. I think they're forms of training our intellects within coherent traditions that we then get to test and prove outside of it and antagonize against other traditions and faiths and things like this. And so I don't actually understand how somebody could learn to be a free independent reasoner if they don't start with some sort of like, well, here's how it is, and then later on you say, but maybe it's different, right? That's yeah, my shtick.
I see your point, but I definitely think that like secularism is not completely devoid of moral precepts, right? And like and direction, right? I was talking recently with my husband about how he was calling virtue ethics juvenile, and I said, well, yes, like, but that's a good form of juvenile, right? Where someone decides like, oh, justice really matters to me, right? And so I'm going to work hard in my life to realize the virtue of justice in the world. And what usually happens with people who operate on a virtue ethic is that they discover that often when you focus too firmly on one virtue, it tends to come at the expense of others, right? And that morality is a project of understanding which virtue or which value is the correct one to realize in each situation, right? And so I don't think it's wrong to say that people need a framework, that people need a foundation, but I don't see how like civics or like classical, like simple classical philosophy, like very trickled down into like basic stuff could not be sufficient for most Americans. Sorry, for most people. I don't know why I'm talking about Americans.
No, I think American civics, that's important. Well, first, we need to set up a debate between me and your husband because calling virtue ethics juvenile is the thing that I will go, oh my goodness, I've never been more infuriated in my life, if you can tell. I'm really agitated by this. Oh my goodness.
He's waiting in the wings. Come in with the steel
Oh,
chair.
my hackles are
Now
up.
it's a
Okay,
2v1, Eucharist. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so civics education is a possibility for this. I don't totally disagree, right? Because I'm a huge proponent of improving our civics education. I would love that. I think one of the problems I might have with that is that the American civic tradition, well, and I told you I want to fight about this someday, but I don't think you can really embed yourself in American political thought, especially American founding political thought, without having a good foundation in religion. That doesn't mean you have to accept it, but so for like, if you just read Adams for 10 minutes, you're going to find him liberally quoting from scripture and Shakespeare and Plutarch. And if you don't understand those three things, well, you're kind of out to lunch. Like you're not going to be able to get it. And it doesn't mean that he's a faithful Orthodox Christian. It means that there's something in the water of this, call it like Hebraic Christian heritage. Judeo-Christian is so outdated. I like Hebraic Christian instead because it doesn't make the Groypers mad as easily because they don't know what Hebraic means. That heritage influences us in a way that I think is essential. And so again, going back to the Tocqueville point, like I don't necessarily agree with Vonnegut or other people that like you can have an insincere religion that accomplishes the benefits of religion, but I do think there's some kind of a religious literacy that is essential to get to wherever we're at, and because of that, I don't know how we could say it's like well now we're past the need for it. That's I guess my sticking point.
Oh, I want to be really clear with you that I think every person should read the Bible. I've read it like 10 times. I strongly advocate that everyone at least pick up the Bible and read it once in their life. And if you don't feel like doing it like front to back, which I also don't recommend doing, there are tons of like liturgical calendar applications you can use and they'll read it out loud to you. I think that in the same way, so like, I think it's important because I advocate the study of literature broadly, right? Especially foundational texts. Like in the same way that I would say it's really, really good for you to have read Cicero or the Ethics or, you know, like whatever classical literature that there is that we have founded our legal system and political system on. We've also founded a lot of our society on Christian precepts, and I'm not going to ever say that you shouldn't know those, because when you are able to parse exactly what our founding fathers are saying when they write each other letters, when they write down like when they're working on laws, I find they most often quote scripture in like letters and speeches rather than like legal documents, obviously. But those references are really valuable to know. So I don't want to be mistaken as claiming that like we should burn Bibles, because that's stupid. What we should be doing is saying like, oh, this is a highly influential religious text that shaped and formed the world where we live, and it has totally unfalsifiable and unprovable claims in it, right? That we're not going to take a stance on, you can take a stance on. But we're also not going to use supernatural ideas or ideas of the divine or ideas of salvation or theological precepts to institute any kind of laws or moral, like to use Eli's ought claims, right? In the same way that like the only reason someone would really get the idea that gay marriage is somehow wrong is like reading Leviticus. And the only reason that someone would get the idea that women shouldn't vote is like by reading St. Paul. I'm sorry, it's like you're gonna have to do a little bit better than that. The dude's fucking misogynist. You know,
you're teeing me up to make the whole audience mad. Okay, let me do a tentative hypothetical, not signing on to either of these necessarily. Like we can argue about them another time because I do have my positions on them, but they're not relevant to this directly. But I guess this may be the point I'm disagreeing with is I don't think that's true actually. Like so, for example, while Plato is more accepting of homosexual relationships than the average fundamentalist Christian, there are parts of Plato that push back against certain kinds of homosexual interactions as fundamentally corrupting and potentially banned in his laws, for example. So there are philosophers in history who are making reasoned arguments from, call it natural law, against sort of call it non-reproductive relations or homosexual relations or whatever. Well, in the women not voting thing, oh gosh, I'm gonna get myself in so much
trouble. In your defense, I'll save you. Ready? Our founding fathers had not yet envisioned a world where a woman would be educated enough to be a responsible voter. Okay,
Abigail Adams' letters hit so hard though, where she's just like, "Do you know?" It's so good. She's like, "Have you not thought that we could participate in this as well?" And he's like, "Shut up."
As someone who is just real quick, as someone who has seen Pearly Things and seen her debate, I'm convincible on repealing the 19th Amendment. You can sway me, okay? Like,
I'm actually a 14th Amendment repealer. I think that it's totally not racist anymore to have not the whole thing, just part of it. I don't think it's racist anymore to take a literacy test to vote.
Yeah,
that's another debate.
Gang, we're joking, by the way. We're joking, but continue. Yeah.
Eucharist.
Let's debate about epistocracy sometime. That'll be fun.
I think it's important to remember that no one's saying like, well, we shouldn't let gay people get married because of Plato. Like they're saying it because of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Sure. There's a lot. So okay, you give some examples in your last debate as well, which was fun to listen to despite the intractability of your opponents. I think the founders are a great example of this, actually, where I'm not as convinced as you are that one that so many of them are the way you describe them as sort of irreligious, more
Well,
sort of
no, many of
deistic
them were
at best.
totally religious.
But uh, also, I think, like Tocqueville or others, I think people like Adams and Jefferson were even skeptical that for the on the whole that we could have a functioning political community where most people were like them. Like I think they were very well cognizant of the fact that they were operating on an intellectual level very different than most of us. And so, that may be pretentious and elitist and all these other things, but I think they were very confident by the end of their lives that, man, people kind of suck and religion actually helps them not suck too much. And it would actually be bad if we could snap our fingers and make more people like us all of a sudden. If you just dispensed with every man's religious fervor overnight, I don't know where you'd be. And I think one of the evidences for this is just the revolutionary period. So much of the revolutionary sentiment is fomented through the pulpit. Like we have sermons from like this. This is a churchman phenomenon in many ways. So I'm not one of these people who's just like, oh well, all of these founders were actually like crypto little orthodox good faithful Christians. Of course not. But there were lots of them who were, and the prominent ones that we think of that aren't are prominent partially because they're outliers in some way.
If I may ask you a question on that, Eucharist, however, is
No,
that not
you may not.
simply a
No,
product of the time, knowing that most of your audience is going to be religious, and the best way to spread those messages are through the pulpit, if you will, and to try to reach people through speaking the language that they understood? And given that we have in modern society, right, we have another form of pulpit, which is right here, social media, streaming, that's reaching millions and billions, I would argue, of people. Not this show, unfortunately, but shows in general. Is religion necessary for these things? I guess my issue with your argument here, Eucharist, is you're pointing to things that, yes, they were foundational, they were necessary for a time, but I don't know if they any longer are. So could you give us, like, why do we still need religion, right? Why is
sure.
it still something that helps people, right?
So two parts of the argument, the historical one first, and then the why do we still need it. The historical one, yes and no to your question of isn't this just a product of the time? So somebody like Franklin, for example, is I think openly and honestly and I think to his audience very knowingly engaging in sort of humorous engagement in religion. Like Franklin very clearly does not believe in a providential God, but he references it quite often. Washington is somebody who's a bit more of a mixed case, where Washington is clearly not sold on his church's beliefs about the Trinity, the resurrection, and everything else, but he does, I would argue, based on the best evidence that I've seen, seem to believe in a providential God that does intervene in history. And so that's different than the deist God of Franklin and Jefferson. And so yes and no, in the sense that there definitely are people who are, yes, this is a product of their times. They are either just indulging it because the people are stupid, or they're just doing it because it's the 1700s and give them 100 years.
Just real quick, I'm not saying that they were insincere in what they were doing. Their
some of them
intention
were.
doesn't matter to my argument here.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that they were naturally incentivized to do so. This is just how people were at the time, but I'm just not seeing where it's still necessary.
Sure.
That's all.
So the still necessary part, I would say, I, like Nietzsche, am not convinced that you get the kind of liberal humanist that we all value without some sort of religious background. And I'm convinced that as that fades, you don't get that kind of person. Instead, you get more of the sort of Nietzschean type. So I don't think, for example, that you can reason from first principles to the kind of self-sacrificial charity that Christ commands and the sort of Sermon on the Mount virtues that we all prize without actually having many sincere religious believers in the background to inculcate that. In a world where you snap your fingers and get rid of the sincere believers, I don't think you retain the moral components that we seem to like.
Okay. Responses to that, Marlo?
I think I really wish that it was the case that there was some tradition that we could point to of like secular, like rank secularists, like forming communities and forming societies and like influencing society in the way that they would see fit, right? And I agree that you don't necessarily just get this like classically liberal, like like ideal philosopher secularist, right, that I'm hoping to see. That's not the necessary downstream condition of atheism. But I also want to point out, like, atheism is a relatively, like, when we're talking historically, a relatively new thing, right? And when we're looking at like what it takes to step out of religion, it's a very disorienting thing. It's a very like life altering thing. It can really like in my life, it has really affected my relationship with my family and a lot of the friends that I once had. Um, and so like we don't haven't seen what it would look like for like truly secular societies to function, except for in a couple of places. We're looking at places like Japan. We're looking at places like Sweden. We're looking at like the Nordic states broadly. And these are extremely successful societies. They're very wealthy. They make a lot of like they do a lot of education. Their quality of life is really high. And so but like there are also other factors, right? Like these are also super racially homogenous societies, right? With not a ton of like outside interference, except for in Japan where we mess with them. So like yes, it's not necessarily the case that secularism gives you this like ideal citizen, but it's also not the case that religion gives you this ideal citizen. So to me, that seems like kind of like a problem of education, right? Like if I could replace every church with a new public school, and just replace every scripture with like a civics education, I think that the world would be like 100 times better than it is, rather than like however good it is right now. Obviously, that's just a hope and a prayer, for lack of a better term.
Responses to
Yeah, I
that?
mean, I think that's it's a fair empirical claim that like, and I think perfectly compatible with Christianity claim that you can find plenty of people who are call them secular good citizens without the sort of sincere religious faith. I think the question I'm pushing towards is how sustainable is that kind of self-sacrificial citizenship that we all seem to value in the absence of some kind of sincere religious faith. So, for example, right, even the civic institutions that we have, which have crumbled in recent decades, think of like, Putnam's Bowling Alone and everything afterwards, like we just don't have the kind of associations we used to. Um, how long do those stick around when they don't have some sort of foundational bedrock moral principle that isn't just sort of arbitrary? I'm not sure. I mean, the Masons are maybe the best example we have over hundreds of years, but they are also just like, well, we're going to like construct our, anybody religious can be a part of our thing. We believe in this great architect creator thing, and fold your morality into it and we can cobble it together. Let's go. I'm not sure that there is an equivalent for just pure secular humanists. And so like,
Yeah.
this is anecdotal, but like, I lived in Madison while I was in grad school, and near my apartment on my way to school, there was this little tiny building that was I think it was called like the Secularists and Atheists Association, or Secularist Atheist Humanists Association or something. And they had this like little running sign that was just like, you don't have to believe in God. It's okay. You can leave your church. And there were always just like 3 70-year-old men hanging out in there. And it was just like, all right, this is, kind of sad, man. I'd rather go to my church, I don't know what the
Yeah.
equivalent is. I mean, like you said earlier, maybe it's the Unitarian Universalists. As far as the stats I've seen, they're not doing so hot. Once we stopped reading Thoreau, people stopped going to those churches. So like, I don't know what substitute there is for that sort of authentic, compelling morality. And maybe I'm just a pessimist about human nature, but it's just hard to get people to do things that are selfless, and the God thing seems to help. That just seems to be the case. Yeah.
I would push back on that in this way. I think that like selflessness is an important factor of morality, right? But I think that largely what I see is like in most like religious precepts, I see this like almost solipsistic view of the self, and like often this has like if you're in a church and this is your inclination, you will often get spiritual guidance to the contrary, right? But there's this tendency of all of us to focus on ourselves. And I think that when the narrative is that like the entire universe was ordered for our species, and like all of human history was ordered for our salvation, it kind of gives you this idea of like what the natural world isn't really. And when we talk about like being certain of those things, we miss a lot of the questions that are good to answer, right? The progress that we made in natural sciences, in physics, in biology, in anatomy, and all of these things are elucidating more and more that the universe has like nothing to do with us, actually. It wasn't created for our benefit, and it wasn't necessarily ordered to orbit around us, right? The good old heliocentric, nonsense. And that extrapolated out gives you this view of like our species as very much animals, very much rational animals. And when we talk about like inspiring selflessness, I don't necessarily agree that like the only way to do this is by some divine superintending personality. I would rather live in a world where people are selfless because they understand that morally and philosophically speaking, that is what's required of a moral actor in many cases. Like I would rather live in a world where someone says, because it is the right thing to do, not because God said I should. And because that allows the moral imagination to seek out greater opportunities, right? When you're asking yourself, what is the right thing to do, not what does God ask me to do, there are a lot more answers available to you, and greater discussions to be had on those topics.
Can I ask you a question as well, Marlo, on that? And then I have a larger question for you that I had, but just on that specifically. Um, would you still have this position even if we could say we had a crystal ball, we could prove this 100%, that religion, um, with religion and religion being a large part of society, you have more selfless moral actors than if you take it away or minimize it, and then you have, there'll still be a few, but significantly less moral actors in that selfless way that you're talking about. Would you still advocate for your position if we could prove that?
So if you could just make sure I understand, if I could see into a crystal ball and know that if I snapped my fingers and it deleted Judeo-Christendom from the face of history,
Religion, just
that
religion
people
in
would
general, right?
just poof gone, that then the world would be a less moral place. That's
Or
the
you'd have
hypothetical
less
there.
selfless actions and actors. So, for example, say in any given town or city, you have 1,000 religious, moral, selfless actors who are like, I believe in God. God told me that I should love my neighbor. And because God has given me this commandment to love my neighbor, I am going to go out there and help the needy, rescue the sick, right? Comfort the downtrodden. And
No, I
you
absolutely
have
would
like
change my
maybe
position in that
100
case.
humanists, right? Secular humanists who say the same thing, but well, I think this is just a right thing to do. So, right, just from a numbers game, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if we could, if you're saying like, oh yeah, a certain future would be this, like I would change my position.
Okay.
Because of the uncertainty of reality, it like that's kind of where I'm arguing from, right?
Okay. So your argument, to just so I'm clear, is that without religion you would have more moral actors.
I think that without institutional spiritual precepts, you would have fewer blocks in the way of moral action.
Okay. What is the main, and I'm going to ask this and then I'm going to use the restroom so you and Eucharist can talk about it, right? But what are the main blocks that religion is given from moral action specifically? I understand what you argued earlier about, oh, it's blocking the way of progress, right? Scientific progress. And that makes sense to me. But when we talk about moral actors and moral actions, what are the main blocks from religion to people doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the blocks tend to be institutional, right? So I'm not saying that like Jesus himself is standing in the way and being like, "No, citizen, do not, give this homeless man $5." Like that's definitely not what we're talking about. But like when I think that a lot of our problems with things like let's use homelessness as an example. There are a lot of people who are totally charitable and kind, and they want homeless people to be off the streets and be healthy and happy and be taken care of and yada, yada, yada. But the arguments that are in the way of an institutional reform for like better and improved funding and rehab centers and housing solutions, et cetera, tend to be arguing from a very evangelical standpoint of like and like I don't even really consider those people Christians, just for the record, you guys don't count. Not you, Eucharist, but you motherfuckers. and that is a religious problem. That is a huge religious problem. They have this like bootstrap morality and this idea that like God sends people the kinds of problems that they need in order to like live a life that where they can learn their lessons. And it's like and you get a lot of like word salad, scripture smorgasbord nonsense from those people when you're asking like, well, I was just gonna give him $5, maybe he's fucking hungry, dude. Like, and like I think that's a microcosm of a lot of the stuff that we do see, right? So like homelessness, contraceptives, like obviously we're gonna have to deal with abortion. Abortion's a really big deal in this space, right? And I want to be clear as an atheist that I think abortion is really, really fucking sad. That fetuses are people. And that there should be really severe and really, really strong limitations on access to abortion, in the sense that it is only okay in certain situations, like the viability arguments, these kinds of things, but that there should be no other things in a person's way seeking an abortion as long as they are within those constraints of like the viability of the fetus and these kinds of things. And as medical science progresses, it's going to be easier and easier to be like, yeah, man, we'll pop that out of there. Just stick it in a NICU and rent it out to somebody in the future, hopefully somebody reputable. But yeah, I think that the liberal take that the fetus is not a person is a really dog shit take, and I think that like we can absolutely answer moral questions of like one person's life and health versus another person's life and health. And but yeah, that's another institutional place where like religious dogma is kind of retarding the conversation and like gumming up the machine of like, okay, well, like, yeah, this is really complicated and sad, but we need to have like a serious conversation about harm and about reality and about problems, not just like babies' souls going to wherever they may or may not go, right?
Okay, before you respond, Eucharist, $5 from my listening library to say thank you for coming on, Eucharist. As an agnostic, I truly enjoy your willingness to interact without mocking those that don't agree with you. $5, gang. Thank you for the $5. $2 from Testicle Johnson to say hail Satan. Thank you for the $2. And then two
That's
more
the
dollars from
religion.
Testicle Johnson to say I've read the Bible, a bit preachy, if you ask me. And gang, if you want to if you have comments, if you've been watching this, and look, if you like this sort of conversation, you have to incentivize me to do this sort of conversation by giving me money, okay? I will do what makes me money. So if this kind of reasonable interaction makes me money, I'll do more of it. If Friday's show makes me more money, I'll do more of that. The choice is yours, dear viewer. Okay, Eucharist, go
Maybe
ahead.
I just need to be more of a jerk. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, which I think is fair. You said, I would rather people said what is the right thing to do rather than what did God say to do. I think that's fair. I guess I would object to what I take to be a kind of underlying assumption, which is that religious people are necessarily on that sort of like divine command side, where I think a lot of historic Christianity sees these things as, call it coincidental, in the sense that these things overlap, right? Where what God has told us to do are the things that are good for us. And so we can learn these things through multiple ways. Speaking of empiricism and scientific progress, this is what Francis Bacon, riffing on the medievals, called, the difference between the book of God's word, his revelation in scripture, and the book of God's works. And of course, Bacon, being not a good Christian himself, is like, well, let's study the book of God's works, and then we can find something that, of course, does not conflict with the book of God's word. But the idea, I think, is that Christian ethical principles actually are the thing that is good, right? So if God tells you to do a thing, and that's the reason you do a thing, and it does actually improve the world, well, isn't that good? And if it is the case that if we stripped away those, call them divine commands, if we strip away the revelation, etc., and fewer people do the good thing, isn't it the case that it would be better to teach them to do the good thing? And so this is, again, leaning heavily on like St. Basil and people like this, is like, I think there's a thick teaching in Christianity that drives us towards the kinds of moral principles that most people in the modern liberal West value, if I do see them elsewhere in like pagan thought, it's like thinner and not as prescriptive. Where in Christianity, it's like, this is the thing you need to do or you're going to hell, you loser. Okay. The other thing too, actually, is I think there is actually an intimate relationship between these doctrines that you are describing as spiritually oppressive or domineering or totalitarian, and some of these better political principles. So there's a tradition, for example, in Baptist history, not that I'm praising Baptists right now, but of basically tying arguments for religious toleration on a political level to the belief in an afterlife and punishment. Effectively saying, so Roger Williams is one of these people. So he's a dissident from the Puritan colonies. So we get, Rhode Island and Connecticut from dissidents from the Puritan Massachusetts. But Roger Williams says, hey, hold on. Let me back up. Rousseau has this really funny quote where he says, it's really hard to just like hang out with somebody you think is going to hell. And I have a friend who's doing scholarship on this right now. Who's like, it's exactly the opposite. Roger Williams says, because I think that man over there is going to hell, because I think God's dealing with it, I don't have to deal with it. My political community does not have to punish his heresy, his dumb speech, his infidelity, his whatever, because God's dealing with it, right? So there are arguments for liberty and religious toleration in history that spring from a belief in afterlife punishment. So I'm not as convinced as you are, I think, that these like strict doctrines that suggest like, oh, here's some sort of punishment or divine retribution that leads to the kind of totalitarianism we all fear. I think it can actually lead to the opposite. But I think you're right. Well, yeah, I'll leave it there. I'm wandering now.
That's a good question. Why? Well, look, there's a lot of political turmoil right now, Marlo, right? A lot of people are saying we have to punish our enemies. Wouldn't the belief that God's going to do it for us just make it easier to just kind of go along to get along?
Sounds like a less just world to me. I believe that people who do wrong should be punished.
Yeah,
but I believe
do
that
defining
so
wrong.
do a lot
is
of the
something-
Christians, yeah.
Right, but when I talk about what is wrong, I talk about what is demonstrably harmful, right? And my whole point is that there are a couple things that get co-opted in under religious dogma that are totally benign, totally fine. Things like, and like I'm going to keep harping on the sexual proclivities realm of morality, right? Things like homosexuality, things like trans identification, things like abortion, things like contraception. All of these are things that fall under like a Christian ethic, where like if we didn't have to contend with like doctrinal, scriptural, supernatural reasons for why these things are supposedly abhorrent, we could have better conversations about what is safe, what is healthy, what is like possible for people to do without harming others, what parts of those things do harm others, if at all, right? And so like I'm not saying like throw all of Christian ethics into the garbage, but because I have already totally bit the bullet that Christian ethics gave us the foundation for our society. I'm saying that we've long outgrown these things, and that including references or reasoning that references the supernatural in an argument for like what a whole collective society should be doing is just harmful. It's just harmful.
So, I guess I'm wondering like how far this extends, right? Because we have people elected to public office who are of various religions, right? So controversial among the MAGA crowd, we have people elected in places like Minnesota and Michigan who are representative of the Muslim faith. And presumably these people's policy proposals and the way that they relate to their constituents is not totally divorced from their faith. We would assume that it interplays in some way. And so I guess I'm just wondering what the limits are here. If you think having religious reasons for doing a policy, whether it's explicitly stated or not, is inherently harmful, like where the bounds are, like at what point does my religion teaches this, and so I think this is a good policy, so I'm going to vote for it. When does that become inherently harmful or necessarily harmful?
I think that it's totally possible to make a secular argument for a religious ethic. And to the degree that you cannot, like, as soon as you step outside of a secular argument for your religious ethic, that is where the line falls, right? So I can say, like, like, maybe I was pro-life, and I said, like, I think that it is just unethical to trod on the rights of the unborn, and like that is a secular argument for essentially a religious belief that this is a soul that deserves to have a chance at salvation, right? And like from my understanding, that's like more broadly the more good faith interpretation of a lot of the religious arguments for the pro-life movement that I hear. Where my point of view is that like the soul is a supernatural concept. I'm not opposed to the concept of spirituality, but like consciousness as it is, and such as it is, like as a measurable vector for experience, doesn't occur and doesn't develop in a fetus until like a certain point in time. And that's almost, we're almost to a point, if I'm correct, where we're able to like measure that very targetedly, very pointedly. And so when the supernatural comes into it, right, the idea of a soul, that is when the line for me has been crossed.
Yeah, on the abortion issue, I don't want to get too far into this because we could have a separate abortion debate if you want. I'd love to, but I think most arguments have to do with what we call the legal concept of personhood, and that can relate to ensoulment, right? You can have a religious argument of when ensoulment happens, but then the real question seems to be, when do we confer this legal status of you have rights like any other person out there in the world? And so if we want to pin it to consciousness, we can. I'm just not convinced that that's like an
I can
argument
sum
that
up
is
my position if it helps.
well. I
The
guess what I'm saying is, like, I don't know that the religious argument necessarily gets dragged in as directly into the abortion argument as you're suggesting, and I think there are lots of. I mean, there's a whole pro-life atheist group that like. I think there are perfectly reasonable reasons somebody could come to the belief that this growing, developing potential, or human with potential, or potential human, however you describe it, is deserving of legal rights. So I don't, yeah. I guess this is one
I
issue,
agree.
like some of the others that you're describing, that there might be some other alternative argument to arrive here that I don't think suggests, like you're saying, that religion is the complicating factor here. I think we would still have pro-life people, even if we snapped our fingers and got rid of all the fundamentalist.
I totally agree.
Go ahead, Marlo.
I just don't think, I think that bringing the supernatural into matters of policy muddies the waters and makes the conversation of what is the right thing to do even more difficult to have. That's what I would say there.
Yeah. That's tough for me too, because like going back to the founders thing, right? I mean, even the ones that we find that are relatively unorthodox, humanist, probably deist, or maybe atheist, they still, especially in the founding era, find occasion to refer to supernatural arguments. And there's this book that I really like. I mean, it's from a religious press, so you can asterisk it how you will, but it's called oh goodness, I'm forgetting the title. It's by Miles Smith. He's a historian at Hillsdale. Hillsdale. He's a great guy though, but it's on basically American religious institutionalism is what he calls it. And he basically tracks the period from the ratification of the Constitution to the Civil War and says what we see in American institutions, whether that's state and local institutions or educational institutions, is an idea that the Christian ethic predominates. So you find state schools, like not religious schools, but state colleges and universities that are saying our purpose is to educate Christian men to go out into the world and do their thing. And so he's sort of summarizing this as like, it's not Christian nationalism, or the nation is not doing this Christian thing, but there seems to be a presumption on the institutional level that it's fine to be teaching these Christian precepts as part of an American civic education. So I think that's a useful maybe counterpoint. I don't know. Maybe I'm just missing you though.
I think, like I said, I don't think it's, I do think it is useful in some ways to have that foundational ethic. But I think it is detrimental in modernity to say that that is the only framework by which you can come to a moral conclusion. I think that things like skepticism are essential in modernity for the pursuit of knowledge. I think that things,
Can I just ask Marlo, like, what I'm struggling with your argument is, how are these things, I guess, what's the word? I'm blanking on it. How are they incompatible? That's a word, with a religious belief system. There are plenty of religious people who are scientists, people who are skeptics in many ways. So how is religious institutionalism, as you define it, contradicting or incompatible with all these things that you would like to see in how we get to, better ideas and better these things?
and you're absolutely right that there are like prominent like doctoral thesis like researchers who are doing physics and all kinds of science that are Christians. in our day and age, this has become a more private matter. And I think for good reason. And the reason I think is the proper answer to your question. The supernatural does not simplify the natural world or moral questions. The supernatural complicates those things, right? And so when we're working as a society to increase our knowledge, to understand more, to do better, the supernatural in all its forms, all of which being unfalsifiable, unprovable aspects of people's lives, right? That they are experiencing, um, makes it so that we work much more slowly towards knowledge and towards right moral action. It is an inhibiting factor, and therefore I think that it is largely incompatible.
I just don't. I don't know if that's true, right? I don't know if that's necessarily what holds these things back. I can grant you, that the authoritarian nature of many religions of the past, who have been closely tied to the state and state power, have absolutely been detrimental to scientific progress. I will just grant you that. But I don't see that as a necessary part of a religious institution. I don't think that a religious institution who does preach supernatural things and kind of uses supernatural teachings as a base would necessarily complicate these questions, especially using the scientific method, right, which we can narrow down to very specific parts. Whether or not your, I guess, personal belief in the soul and whether it exists or not, is how large a part that is to you. I just don't see it necessarily getting in the way of someone asking a question like, "Hey, what are the best types of methods to vaccinate a population or to inoculate a population against various diseases?" I just don't see the necessarily
The
contradiction.
incompatibility for me comes down to, I'll make it really quick, I
Yeah,
promise.
please. I don't mean to.
Comes
I
down
don't mean to
to, no,
grab
please,
the
yeah.
conversation, right? But I'm
Um,
just asking.
the incompatibility factor for me does largely come in when we're talking about the worst kinds of religious people, and I don't want to say that I think that all religious people are like this, but I definitely there's an excellent book called "The Violent Take It by Force" by a man named Matthew Taylor, I want to say, and it's about the American movement of like charismatic evangelical fundamentalists who largely contributed to Donald Trump's first electoral success, and the ways in which religion has eroded into an anti-intellectual, conspiratorial, like us versus them, nearly fascistic, like dominion theory march across the face of this country, right? And so I think that either we need to severely check all religious institutions to prevent this kind of retardation, or we need to be extremely critical of, well, actually, I think the proper thing is to seriously apply pressure to religious institutions that are slackening in their education and their literacy and any of that stuff. Because I, the world would be a better place if I could look into a crystal ball and see a future where none of those people were acting as like moral agents in my country
Sure,
any
but you,
longer.
you have these very secular nations as well. You mentioned Sweden, Japan, and other things, but there's China, and there's the USSR, very secular, not very. Oh, are you okay, Eucharist? Are you
No, just China, China. I'm
China?
just
Oh, okay.
China.
I was
just
like,
doing.
what is
Yeah,
he yelling at me
sorry.
about China? China's a
No,
secular
no,
nation. No,
no, no.
okay, yeah, but these are, I would argue, like also absolutely detrimental to progress and human flourishing, and religion played no part, or at least unless it was a um right a push against religion, right, and a demonization of religion, and religion was used as a scapegoat to justify a lot of authoritarian overreach by USSR and China both, right?
While that's true, I definitely think that I actually include both the CCP and the USSR, well, the USSR and Russia today, under the kind of spiritual totalitarianism that I'm discussing, because they
Hold on.
use a lot of the structure.
Okay, how do you hold on? CCP and USSR, how do they
And
fit the
Russia today.
definition of spiritual supernatural totalitarianism? Walk me through that.
Because totalitarianism in government receives its structure from religious institution of like an unquestionable, like divinely ordained leader at the top whose like word is law, where you cannot it's still dogma. And in so many respects, those things are still religion. I consider communism a religion. I'm sorry.
That's just a broad definition. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the debate, right? But I was just that's a if your definition of religion includes communism, that's a broad definition. I would.
It is.
Go ahead, Eucharist. Do you have comments?
Sorry, my children are yelling at me. No, if I could steel man, I guess the religion point, it was like what I was describing earlier with what I was teaching from Mill today, the idea that if you get taught a dogmatic thing, if you're in a community, so he talks about two types of tyranny, right? We usually associate tyranny with tyranny of the political ruler, restricting where you can go, what you can do and say. But there's another type of tyranny, he says, which is the tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of opinion, or the tyranny of custom, which he says constrains your thought. And that's just as dangerous, he says, actually. The tyranny of fashion or opinion is just as dangerous. So if I grow up in a church that says, here is our creed, and you have to believe it, and if you believe something different than that, or if you ask questions that challenge the boundaries of it, then you're going to sort of be tamped down. You're going to be offensive to us, and you will lose your family and friends and everything else. That restricts the exercise of your reason. I think that's sort of what Marlo is describing here, which is just like, in general, if you accept a dogmatic faith, it's not just that it leads to policy that will make you unfree. It's that it leads you to have a mindset that is going to tamp down any exploration. So, I mean, I don't mean to be personal. Wait, all right. So you've grown up in a church that has, okay.
Yeah, but that also applies to things like secularism and things like that. We can look
100%.
at like,
totally.
Yeah,
totally.
We can look at the like
anything that has a dogma that says this is what you must believe and you may not question it. That would fall under this.
If
yes,
we could, okay, my followers are gonna yell at me.
Do it.
Okay,
do it.
Followers are gonna yell at me, and don't yell at me. There is an argument that wokeism, right? And what I mean by that, right? What I mean by that is the idea that you can't question certain things about reality, like when we talk about racial differences on a genetic level, you shouldn't really look into that. And there's been many different cancellations and things like that, right, that have absolutely retarded our progress in certain areas. And would you consider
you guys love using that word in this context?
Woke
and I love
is
it.
a dogma.
It's really great.
Well, it's the proper use of the word.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Woke.
100%. There's a book called.
I just don't consider that a like. That's why I guess I'm struggling with the argument about religion specifically, because this just seems to be like a way of thinking that comes about whether you have religion or not.
You're making my point for me. I agree.
Sorry,
I'm trying to steel man. Okay, you're making my point for me, but I agree. But it most commonly comes, I think, in our experience, through institutions that teach you, call it like a statement of faith or a catechism or confessions like you get in the Christian church, like that this is the constrained belief, right? But I think you're totally right that this manifests in different ways. So there's this book, I don't recommend all of it wholeheartedly, but it's called American Awakening by Josh Mitchell, who's a professor of government at Georgetown. Really good book. And he makes this argument. He says that wokeism effectively is a kind of religion, and that it's a religion that's taking pagan origins, basically, that's asking for a scapegoat for absolution for the pollution that comes through the sin of some sort of discrimination, etc. It's a great book, and I think you're articulating something that's very true. But I think what Marlo would get at, or what other people would get at, is that the most common source of these restricting ideas in our brains is religious dogma.
Yeah, but that's just
I obviously don't agree with that, but I think it's fair.
That's just a historical artifact. Yes, it mostly happens because of religious institutions, but that's because up until very recently, especially Western society was just filled with religious institutions. Most of the institutions happen to be religious. So I don't know if we can necessarily draw that conclusion. Does that make sense?
I'd be happy to walk back from religion to dogma, but I also I definitely, so like you get into like an iffy place, right? Where like back into the presuppositionalist thing, right? Where there are always going to be some kind of assumption that you're making. And like the world I want to live in is where when people don't know, they say, I don't know. That's why I said that to Eli and Kung Fu Joe. They're like, so like, what do you think started the universe? And I said, I don't know.
And then
That's
they
my
dunked
point.
on you in 4K and just declared
Straight up.
victory.
Well,
Like, but that wasn't
I
their
think
religion
that was like
that
an
did
L
that.
on their part.
Yeah, but that wasn't their religion that did
Yeah.
that. That was the incentives of social media, right? Which is
Well,
like a
there's that
problem.
too. I think that dogmatic.
do,
Oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead,
go ahead.
Marlo. No, Marlo. I want to
Well,
hear from Marlo. No.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I just think that dogmatic thinking does have its kind of like supernatural origins in religious like texts, and that it's like, and dogmatic thinking has been kind of like shepherded by people in authority for centuries and centuries and centuries, to the benefit of the shepherds in many ways, like not necessarily always for evil. Obviously, I'm not going to say that, but I just think that like forfeiting your moral reasoning and like outsourcing your moral reason to a higher power is cucked and un-American.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I had thoughts, but they've
Sorry,
gone.
I didn't mean to
Sorry.
interrupt.
Well,
Go ahead.
no, it's okay. It's
Hold on, just real
it-
quick though, Marlo. Like, you mean seeding that a scientist who is an expert in vaccines might know more about it than I am? I don't think that's cucked. I think that's just recognizing like, I'm not an expert on these subjects. Maybe I don't have all the answers, and so there are. We all do this. There are people who I look up to and try to emulate, and what better person than Christ, if we're going to go the Christian route, right? Like the perfect example, right? I mean, even non-Christians would argue if if all Christians acted more like Jesus Christ, wow, right?
would be right. I mean, like even like so we have like Thomas Jefferson's Bible, right? And he
Yeah.
talks about how like, and like I'm sure you know about it, but like for the followers, like Thomas Jefferson had this Bible where he like ripped out everything that was like a reference to the supernatural, and like all that was left was like some stories and some history and some genealogies, and he was like, this is the Bible now, for himself personally. And we have quotes of him talking about like, if we see statues sweating or calves speaking or any of that stuff, we just, it's stupid Judaism and fables, right? Because that's how the founding fathers
Those
liked to talk
Jews,
about that kind of
yeah.
stuff. They're always making shit up, apparently, according to these guys. And
it's the papists and the Jews, man.
I tell ya. And so like that is a totally reasonable way to outsource your moral reasoning to another person, right? Because you're not outsourcing the you're still maintaining your volition. You're saying these are the things that seem reasonable to me and these are the things that don't. And like in a sense every religious person is doing that, right? But when it comes to the parts of the book that you can say actually make my life a better life, you can't say that about any of the supernatural qualities because those things are completely not provable, right? I'm only going to advocate that you take a vaccine because I have data that shows that if you take the vaccine, then fewer people get sick, right? You can talk to me about like, you should love your neighbor because you don't want to get your house burned down, but because you flipped your neighbor off in traffic, right? Like this, it's good for you. Like obviously good for you.
$5 from Testicle Johnson to say Wick is a closeted Mormon. One day you will reclaim Zion, aka Missouri. Thank you for the $5. Then $5 more from Testicle Johnson says, I agree. More people should be like Christ. Stop procreating. Thank you for the additional $5. Look, I read Holy Blood, Holy Grail. That's just something they covered up. He had many children. Oh, anyway, sorry, it's conspiracy. But I want to give a chance to Eucharist. I feel like I've kind of started just.
No, this is great.
Right?
I want you participating.
I
because-
have thoughts. So go ahead, Eucharist, please.
No, I want you in. Yeah. Man, I just kind of don't know where to go because it's like, I guess my fundamental claim is that the ideas that we are working with, sort of the fodder that we're rooting around in, has, I would say in the West, especially Christian origins. And I don't know how we maintain it while saying we should get rid of those Christian beliefs among a certain segment of the population. So even people like Jefferson, I take to be, I would call it, oh, this is arrogant, but I would call Jefferson fundamentally naive. Okay, so he has this letter that he writes to a friend where he's writing about the establishment of what would become the University of Virginia, and he's talking about the type of subjects they're going to teach at this new university, and he conspicuously leaves out theology because the University of Virginia, on Jefferson's account, is founded as a counterpoint to the College of William and Mary, which is an Episcopal school. So he says, well, over there they're training priests. Here we're going to train scholars and scientists. So he leaves out theology. We don't teach theology. But he goes on this like emotional tirade, and he's like, these morons who think we should be teaching these Gothic presuppositions, going back into the annals of history for what's true in morals and politics, these bozos they're fools, right? So Jefferson is very extreme in this. He says, we don't read Plato and Plutarch and people like this for any moral lessons. We read them to learn about their errors and how we can improve on them. What Marlo said at the beginning is sort of a progressive view. I think that's fair. I think it's a fair view, right? But Jefferson, in many ways, is very extreme and also, I think, is unwittingly an inheritor of some of these Christian ideas that he wants to hang on to. So if you go read the Declaration, I don't think we get the Declaration without the history of Christianity. And I don't think we get the maintenance of Christian rights without some sincere religious belief.
You keep retreating to the independence and the founding fathers, but we're talking about today. Today, the people who are claiming the
mantle... She brought up Jefferson! I'm responding to her!
The people who are claiming the mantle of religiosity are the people like Andrew Wilson, right? The people who want to basically turn us into a Christian nation, Christian nationalism nation. And surely you would agree with me that that is harmful, that is not good, that it is making our politics a worse place because of how these people have been using religion, right, in the modern day.
I'll tell you, Wick, it depends on what day you catch him on. Because some days he'll say, all I mean is that Christians should be able to vote for the things that they believe in. Isn't that just, don't you believe in democracy? Shouldn't you just vote for the things that you think are good? You're saying I can't vote for the things that I think are good? That's one day he'll say that. But then other days he's like, get rid of the 19th Amendment. Women shouldn't vote. Get these people out. So I can't really comment on that because I have no idea what his actual position is because he waffles so much. And by the way, our good mutual friend Origin has tagged him so many times on Twitter trying to provoke him into debating me. I would love to debate him anytime, but I don't know what we'd argue about. But I don't know what he actually thinks because he waffles so much. I think you're right? So the people who latch onto this label of Christian nationalists who most advocate for the influence of religion in politics are advocating for things that I don't think cleanly follow from what I'm arguing, which is just that the foundation of our politics is Christian, which we have a system that I would call Western liberalism, which I think has an inheritance from Christian moral and political teaching. And it's the kind of stuff that I say all the time that Nietzsche was just burnt up about, right? When Nietzsche looks at the history of moral philosophy and says, there was a revolution in morality when the Jews and the Christians convinced us all we should care about the weak and the poor and the downtrodden. I'm like, yeah, we did. And it's based. You loser. That's what I think.
They're like training wheels. If you always have them on, you won't ever get better at riding a bike. They might be necessary at first. They might be good at first to help teach you kind of the basics, but eventually you got to get rid of them.
Okay, let's imagine instead of as training wheels, that Christian morality is more like the principles of physics, right? That they're necessary to get you balanced on that bike, and you may not understand how they work, but if you snap your fingers and get rid of them, you're going to fall off the bike. That's what I would say.
Yeah, sure. If you make your analogy the fundamental core building block of the universe,
exactly.
Your analogy works.
My analogy
Great. Awesome. Okay, sorry, Marlo, go ahead.
Oh no, please. I genuinely think that it would be totally a mistake to try to erase Christendom from the face of the earth, erase religion from the face of the earth. It was humanity's great cultural achievement of, the fucking Bronze Age and of the fucking, Iron Age and of the, and moving on forward from there. For a long time, it was the coolest shit we had, and I think it's awesome and base. But religion's contributions to human society at this point have been overshadowed by humanity's ability to problem solve for itself.
But for itself on what basis, right? Because I think end up arguing would be that the problem you're attempting to solve. about poverty, for example, right? The fact that you even view poverty as a problem is partially an inheritance of.
But no, it's not. It's not. Like it's. How do I put this? You don't have to be a religious person to believe that poverty is wrong, right? We have a society that was informed by religion, but like to like I'm not still trying to put on my size 5 kid shoes anymore, right? I have my big girl shoes. My feet got bigger. You know what I mean? Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the like
Oh no!
it is an
Don't make me do the
outgrowing.
precept thing. Don't make me do the
Oh
precept thing.
man,
Then,
come
but then how would
on!
you? But then how would you justify your care for? That I think that's the next question,
Don't
which I
have to
don't want to
justify
do.
my care for the poor and lowly. Like that's actually
You don't
it
have
is
to.
like a natural no, because it's like it's a totally normal innate thing to for a
Why?
human
No, it's
creature
not.
to
Wait, hold on.
look at
Oh,
another human creature and worry about their well-being. That's like
but it's
normal.
not normal and innate though, right? Like most people throughout history have not thought that's normal and innate, right? We have this meme. I don't know if it's accurate to the anthropologist whose research is being riffed on this stupid
Well, I'm
meme.
talking about
Right? There's this
modernity.
meme. There's this meme that comes up every now and then that's like people asked all these different scholars when civilization started, and this one woman anthropologist said it's when we found the first healed broken
Like,
bone because it meant that we helped out somebody who was sick and injured, right? That is, even in that context, even in that stupid meme context, an innovation, right? It's new, and somebody had to come up with that, and somebody had to say, well, that's something we actually support and sign on to. And so I again, I don't want to do the dumb precept thing, but I want to say I don't think it's as obvious as we sometimes think it is that this is what we should do. I think we have assumptions in the background that lead us that direction that I would credit Christianity for, historically speaking. Yeah.
right, but it is possible to get to all of the moral precepts and the moral injunctions of Christianity from a naturalist perspective, right? And a lot of people get to those precepts from different philosophical backgrounds, right? And like when we talk about like John Stuart Mill and like liberty, what we're talking about is a like a liberal society, a progressive liberal society where like we, because of our origins, are ordered to, not ordered in the sense of commanded to, but we have an order that encourages virtue and the realization of values and the making of the world into a better place. Like, especially if we make legislation about getting kids off of social media, just as a plug.
Oh well,
Please God, I'm so
100% support that.
But like when we talk about what is the right thing to do, right? Like which is kind of like I keep harping on this question. It's really easy to answer what is the right thing to do. It's easy for a Christian and a secularist to get the same answer on most things, right? You and I don't disagree on like should I, swerve out of the way if I'm driving and someone's standing in the road, even if I have right of way. Like we shouldn't run people over. And like I think it's because I think that people with consciousness, conscious creatures shouldn't experience suffering, and you think it's because there's an immortal soul that's worth preserving, right? But like that's the same answer, but you can get to those answers from totally secular philosophical frameworks. Like it's
I
not
guess
it's not an essential ingredient of morality. It's completely non-essential to morality.
so.
Religion
Going
is.
back to my Vonnegut point, okay. Little Kurt here. I keep him on my desk to remind me. I am not convinced of why I should be a Kurt Vonnegut kind of humanist as opposed to a Nietzsche kind of humanist outside of some input from the sort of things I think you're saying are maybe in most cases today harmful, right? So I don't know. So Kurt Vonnegut reads the Sermon on the Mount and is a humanist and all these things. But then Nietzsche is like, yeah, but like you guys are just clinging to the vestiges of God and religion and the things that make me want to care about other people as opposed to my nature, which is just expressing strength and power. And I'm not sure why I should side with one over the other without that outside input. I, of course, as a Christian, love my baby Kurt. Okay. Kurt is amazing. Kurt's humanism is something that I find very appealing. I agree with him. I wouldn't want to be a human if Jesus had not preached the Sermon on the Mount, but I just like all that you've described of like, I think you could reason your way to this without the religious precepts. I kind of agree, but I don't know why I would side with that reasoning as opposed to other reasoning that exists that pushes me in the opposite direction. That is more ruthless as opposed to
Well,
humanist.
I think it's because we have like a society where people disincentivize you from being a huge asshole. Broadly.
Well, yeah, I mean, society can keep me from
Hold
doing
on.
that.
Who's
That's
the president
that,
of the United
but then,
States,
as
Marlo?
Thrasymachus says, justice is nothing other than
Good point.
what we call the interest of the stronger. right? It's just what the powerful people told us to think. That's
Right,
what
but like,
society
do
is.
you agree that like what like to Wick's point, he's like, well, what about the president of the United States? Which I'm sure I'm sitting in a room with three people who think he's retarded. Like I think it's important to remember that like the reason why we have an immoral person in Oval Office right now is because there is a like an anti-intellectual, dogmatic, anti-reason, anti-truth faction that is like emulating the types of Christians that I have specifically called out as being the worst kinds. And
Well,
like they have that's their intellectual inheritance from that sphere.
yes, but that's a problem with a certain religion. I would argue, and perhaps you, Chris, would disagree with me, perhaps not.
I agree
That
that with
if
that too.
more people actually practiced the and believed in and were Christians in the sense of discipleship, right? Trump
Right,
wouldn't have won at all, right? He wouldn't have won
right.
even like a local election. It just wouldn't have happened. So I guess that
I
you're
want
right when it comes to like our current political sickness, but I don't know if that makes you right in terms of religion.
I want to I'm going to find the link here in a second because it's something that I think that you would really like to hear, Eucharist. There Timothy Snyder gave a really cool talk on at the New York Public Library. I think it was like early last year about the kind of like pagan nature of our current epistemological emergency. And he's talking about how like Christendom in the West was this like it was a gathering force, and it was a force for education, and it was a force for moral education. It was a force for like law and order, and it was a force for like systems and institutions to grow and be created, right? And the argument that he makes in this lecture, and which is just a beautiful lecture, is that our current modern like the tip of what we're looking at socially in America is this like new form of paganism where things are like institutions are being smashed and things are being set up as idols, and people are worshiping based on like kind of their most base animal impulses, and like kind of like domineering and conquering rather than cooperating and learning together, right? And so the I think that like when I'm talking about modern society, I want to be so clear with you. I don't think that Americans are participating in that right now. I think that we are in the fucking dark ages in our country, and that we have way bigger fish to fry, actually, other than like, you know, is religion doing us any good or not? Like, you know, it's fun to be on the show and to yap about it because it's a thing that matters to me most, but like, we're at a point where there's way worse problems in our country that I wouldn't even call us a like proper society or a properly modern society anymore anyways. So once you get into the like 2016 forward era, we got a lot of issues, even like looking at reality and being like, is this real? So I find that link.
Go ahead, Eucharist. You're muted. Okay,
I
there you
missed most of that because my child came
Rats.
downstairs to yell at me about not giving them candy or something. I don't know. So what I heard was interesting, and I wish I had heard more of it to give a substantive
It's okay.
response. So
I'm just gonna send you a link to a lecture that I think you would like to hear, and you can DM me back about it sometime.
beautiful.
But for the sake of like the stream, um,
Uh-huh.
the idea is like the whole summary of what I said was that like um, I don't think America is informed by religion so socially or culturally anymore. Insofar as that has been overshadowed by a completely different kind of dogmatism, which I think is even worse, and also like an even bigger problem. And so
so I
yeah,
mean,
I'm kind of tempering my stance here.
but doesn't that like almost speak directly against it when there is a void, right? And when people move away from the religion of their fathers, right? The God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob, a new God kind of comes in to fill that void. I guess my question, this is for
Oh,
both of you actually. This is for both of you actually. Um, is the concept of God something that humans need in their life, right? Or the concept of a higher thing, a higher power, whether that be a god or just an ideology.
Alcoholics Anonymous seems to think so.
Right. What do you think, Eucharist?
I'm going to say yes, in the sense that I think we all coincidentally arrive at some various conception of this higher power you're describing. It's going to take various forms and will get fleshed out in different ways. So you have gods that are what's his name? I forget who is it, Huxley? Somebody famously first described it as like a god of the gaps. That's just like, I don't understand how the lightning works, so I come up with a god. But then there are other gods that are like the gods of the philosophers that are more fleshed out, that are like, this is a precondition for all reality, etc. But I do think, yes, that search for a higher power is something that seems to be inherent to human nature and makes me skeptical again of the possibility of ever getting past religion. So
yeah,
that's,
because if what you're saying, just to kind of almost piggyback on that, if that is true, then we should probably be looking to point people towards the best God rather than taking away religion and being godless. Because if the human nature points us towards, or I guess pushes man to look for something higher, then we want something in place that will not be overly destructive, right?
Right. I think you see this in fiction, which is, not determinative of my argument, but like the 28 Days Later series, like when you get the post-apocalyptic like rise of cults and things like this, I think you see this in a lot of fiction where it's like where there's a gap, people seek for an alternative, and I would prefer the alternative be the better benevolent god that I think exists than the one that a lot of these cults come up with. So that'd
I'm
be
curious to Marlo's answer to the question too. Is humanity, do they naturally need, for lack of a better word, a god?
I think that human beings are naturally curious. And I think that's kind of where a lot of this comes from. And like, especially with like, I think that 28 Days Later is actually really interesting, like literary, uh, like example of like those gaps being filled. Um, but I think that I genuinely think that like the more that humans advance the knowledge of the world as it is, and further scientific discovery, what we come out of those things is like knowing how much we don't know about so many more things than we didn't know before, right? Like all of these categories of new questions get like brought about by every discovery, and I think that the infinite curiosity of humankind is a natural good impulse for like something that evolved to have all of this nonsense between their ears, and I think that looking for ultimate answers is a really natural, once again, impulse. But I think that like I think there's every possibility that as we continue to grow in our knowledge or in our lack thereof, and as we continue to expand what we're able to see and what we're able to understand, my prediction is that the impulse to seek answers in the divine will begin to slowly lessen and become and fall out of favor, because I think that our curiosity is better directed towards answers that can perpetually be asked and searched and then sometimes even answered. And I think that's really that would be like the progression, and then like the regression would be falling into cultism and paganism and and slavish worship of various nonsense. But yeah.
I guess I'm just seeing in a world, and not just because it's not just America that's going through this right now, is we are tending to move towards, or we have a large portion of our populace who's tending to look for a strong man, right? Someone that they can kind of set aside their will and follow, right? The will of the strong man, right? And I think that plays in, or it's at least evidence to me, that mankind is just in human nature to look for a god, to look for a being or a principle or something that they can dedicate themselves to. And I worry getting rid of religion or moving away from religion is not actually possible. It's just something that we can't do. That's my worry.
I sure hope not, personally, but
Fair enough.
I'm prejudiced, and I admit it. Prejudiced, and I admit it.
We are all prejudiced, I guess. I guess, do either of you have any I guess questions for each other that they haven't addressed yet, or any questions for me that you think would be interesting to bring up? Yeah.
I am curious to kind of to wrap it up about Eucharist's theological background and like what denomination he's a part of.
Yeah, so I grew up very independent Baptist, and then in high school, when I started sort of reading scripture and studying theology for myself, I became very reformed. I joined a PCA church, and that's where I am now. I'm a member of
Oh,
the Presbyterian Church in America. So yes, I'm a filthy Calvinist, and all the things that come with it. So yeah.
uh, well, I'd still take a Presbyterian over most sects, personally. I respect that.
What about you,
I grew
Marlo?
up.
What's your religious background? I'm really curious now, since we're bringing it up.
I grew up Southern Baptist General Convention until I was about 10 years old. My father was a preacher. And then when I was about 10, he got ordained as an Anglican priest. So then throughout my like adolescence and adult life until I was about 25, I studied the church fathers and explored like early Christian theology because I really wanted to, because a lot of it's just gorgeous, just fucking gorgeous. I really wanted to be sure that, well, to be honest with you, I was a little bit of like a little like female Charlie Kirk for a while, like running around challenging everybody and being like, do you know your scripture? And yeah, because I felt like Christians were being really fucking
Very
hypocritical all the
womanly of
time. And
you,
I was
but
like,
go ahead.
you guys aren't fucking Christian enough. Yeah, and being a little nag and like freaking out and like getting rude, like being rude to everybody who like I thought was being hypocritical of the faith. And then eventually I realized like I couldn't find an example in my time of people who I thought were genuinely exemplary of like what Christianity stood for, myself included. And so I kind of just slowly faded out.
But now you've met Eucharist, so are you gonna come back?
I'm probably not. I will. I am planning to try a Unitarian Universalist congregation because what I miss the most are potlucks and hymns.
Singing hymns is a wild experience if you're not a Christian, if you didn't grow up in a church. The like singing everything, like it's not just a concert, right? All these people singing parts, and oh, it's wild.
No,
It's a
look,
great experience. Yeah.
I grew up Mormon, right? And we had actual hymns, right? We had a hymn book. And I've gone to, I guess, Protestant services, and those things are like, look, my buddy, when I was young, I was like 16 years old. My buddy comes up, is like, hey, you want to go to a heavy metal concert with me? I'm like, hell yeah, I want to go to a heavy metal concert. Let's go,
Tell
right?
me it was
And
Skillet.
he drives me to a church, and I'm like, what is going on? And it wasn't. It was like a heavy metal Sunday service, and it was very weird. It was very odd. Like they would go, they had their heavy metal stuff, and then they had this intermission where we all had to bow our heads and we had to raise our hands if we hadn't been saved and things like that. And people would
Cringe.
come in and they would the
So
guy in the
cringe.
background with the bass was just going da 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 da, and the whole time this guy's preaching. It was wild. And so I just don't understand that culture.
Dude, the metal scene out in West is crazy. My cousin took me one time to an actual metal concert at a church on a Saturday night. They use their gym, right? And he stage dove off the stage during a metal show, and the security cook kicked him out. And so I went out with him because he was my ride. And he went outside the church and he fell on his knees before the security man and said, "You have kicked me out of the house of God. Whence shall I go from here?" And that's it's the proudest I've ever been of a man in my life. It was amazing.
That's funny. Anyway, gang, so
It's
I think
beautiful.
we've kind of run the gamut here. We're beginning to circle the drain. I think it's been a great discussion. Gang, I'm going to give each of these lovely individuals a closing statement where they can tell you where you can find them. And I've given links to their stuff in the YouTube description. You can go check it out, to Marlo's Discord and to Eucharist's Substack. And I encourage you to do so, right? What we got coming up in the week, I'll just tell you before we get to closing statements. So tomorrow, I'm going to have call-ins. Then Wednesday, I'm going to be having a discussion with an individual. Is ICE a necessary evil? And that should be a fun debate. And then on Thursday, we're going to have Usurp the Chef, Kalindra, and they're going to be fighting Doobie and Primekai on whether or not the left is a net negative to the Democratic coalition. And that should be a wonderful discussion. So if you like this kind of content, if you want to reward this kind of content, gang, we made so much money in January. We're not making that much in February. So we gotta get those numbers up. So just throw me some dollars if you want to support the program. Would really help me out. Super chats, bits, things like that. All these things would help the channel. And if you don't have any money, that's okay. You can still help the channel by liking, subscribing, following. All these things are great. That out of the way, I pass my hat around. We also have a charity run that we're participating in. And Ukrainian Anna's running it. And I have a link to it in my YouTube description. It's called Warm Hugs for Ukraine. And it's going to help the people of Ukraine who are suffering without power, right? They get a lot of missile attacks on their power, electricity grids and power grids and stuff, who are suffering this winter, just to buy stuff to keep them warm. So if you're feeling generous and you want to exercise some charity, there's a link there, and I encourage you to go and give a little bit. Please do. I've already donated. I donated about $50, 50 pounds, I guess. They're whatever currency they are doing. And I encourage you to do the same. Please give. And if you consider yourself a Christian, that is one of the things that you are commanded to do. It's not not optional. Okay, that's enough of that. I'm gonna let Eucharist go, and I'm gonna let Marlo have the last word. So Eucharist, closing statements.
Yeah, so apparently I need to fight Marlo and her husband on multiple issues in the future, but this was a great talk. I enjoyed it. I just fundamentally agree with Nietzsche on many points, which is that the moral heritage we are swimming in the West is a, call it Judeo-Christian, call it Hebraic-Christian inheritance. That our moral regard for the poor, the weak, the downtrodden is something that comes from religion, and I'm not convinced can be sustained without religion. And so where I differ with Nietzsche is I think this transformation, this revolution, this a slave revolt in morality is actually based. It's awesome. I appreciate that Jesus did that for us. And so I want to continue the heritage that we get from the Sermon on the Mount and related ethical traditions. I agree that current Christian politics does not always meet that standard, but I would love for more Christians to embrace it. So I think we should embrace our heritage, oppose these dirty secularists, and fight for our ethical principles in the battlefield of ideas and say our ideas are better than theirs. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. As always, Eucharist, one of my favorite people to have on, and he's I think a great example of a Christian, and I guess that's probably the best praise I can give him. Let's give it next to Marlo, please.
Gotta agree that Eucharist is so far one of my favorite examples of a Christian that I've met, especially in an internet space. God bless, for lack of a better word. To wrap things up, I would say that like the what I'm resting on is that I consider religion to be manufactured. I consider ethics to be independent of religion, and I consider it to be immoral to bring the supernatural into ethical conversations. And I'm very carefully using the words I consider there, because those are all things you can absolutely attack me on. And that if you want to have a fight about it, the Discord channel for the Gondom and Gilmore podcast is where I hang out. Come say hi to us and tag me in the chat and blow me out, man. It'll be great. I love getting argued with. But y'all have a good night.
Thanks for being here, gang. $5 more from Feder Methodist to say God is dead, Nietzsche 1882, Nietzsche is dead, God 1900. $50 from Robert Paulson to say good job, everyone, even Wick, who extorts me, and I will extort
His
you.
name is Robert Paulson. His name is Robert Paulson. Okay.
Okay. Anyway, thank you for being here, gang.
You not seen Fight Club? You've not seen Fight Club? Come on.
Look, we're going to raid out into Prime Kai, so make sure you tell him that this is a hate raid, and I'll see you guys tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to blow me out, get in line. Okay, I'll talk to you guys later. I love you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.